Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something that uh, might sound a little dry at first,
Yeah.
FEMA's Buy America Preference Policy.
Right.
But trust me, this is one of those rabbit holes that gets surprisingly fascinating the more you start digging into it.
Right.
You've sent us a whole bunch of documents on this, and
Yeah.
our mission is to help you cut through all the jargon and really understand what this policy means for real-world projects on the ground.
It's interesting how something like a procurement policy
Yeah.
can actually have these huge ripple effects,
Yeah.
touching everything from local fire stations to these massive infrastructure projects.
Right, we're talking about the Build America, Buy America Act, or BABAA for short.
Right.
I'm guessing most people haven't even heard of it.
Probably not.
But it's this law that basically dictates which materials can be used in federally funded projects. And FEMA, of course, being a federal agency, has to play by these rules.
Yeah. Exactly. So if you're involved in, say, applying for a FEMA grant to rebuild a bridge after a natural disaster,
Right.
you need to be aware of these Buy America requirements. It can really impact everything from your budget to your project timeline.
Okay, so let's start breaking this down. We've got these two appendices from your documents,
Okay.
Appendix A and Appendix B.
Okay.
Appendix A is kind of a surprise. It's this laundry list of FEMA programs, way more than you might think.
It is. It's pretty extensive. You've got everything in there from fire grants to dam rehabilitation projects,
Wow.
even cybersecurity initiatives, basically. If FEMA's funding it, there's a good chance Buy America applies.
And Appendix B is like the flip side, right?
Yeah.
The programs that are exempt from this whole Buy America thing, I'm guessing most people would assume this policy covers every single FEMA program, but that's not the case.
It's important to know where those boundaries are. It can really help streamline the process if you know from the get-go whether or not Buy America will be a factor in your specific project.
All right, so now let's talk about the materials themselves. We're talking about things like iron, steel, manufactured goods, construction materials. Basically the building blocks of any infrastructure project. It's like if you're building a house, you need the raw materials like lumber and concrete.
Yeah.
But you also need prefabricated windows, doors, appliances. All of that falls under this Buy America umbrella.
And that's where things get really specific. The policy lays out very clear definitions for what qualifies as produced in the United States.
Oh, really?
Take iron and steel, for example. Every single step of the manufacturing process,
Right.
from melting the ore to coating the finished product, has to happen within U.S. borders. No outsourcing allowed.
No cutting corners.
Nope.
But with manufactured goods, like those prefab windows we were talking about, it gets even more complex, right?
It does. There are all these rules about calculating the cost of components to determine if enough of that product is truly American-made.
So it's not just about where the final assembly happens.
Right. You have to break down the cost of each part, figure out the percentage that comes from domestic sources, and, this can get tricky, especially with global supply chains being so interconnected these days.
I'm already getting a headache just thinking about all the calculations.
Yeah.
But here's a real head scratcher from the source material.
Okay.
Did you know that fire trucks and ambulances are exempt from this policy?
Oh, really?
I mean, they clearly use infrastructure like roads and highways.
It does seem counterintuitive, but the logic is that they're considered end-user products rather than construction materials.
Hmm.
And another interesting exclusion is projects for private homes. Those aren't subject to Buy America either.
So a fire station built with FEMA funds has to follow Buy America.
Right.
But if someone's house is damaged in a flood and they're getting FEMA assistance to rebuild, they can use whatever materials they want.
It does highlight some of the nuances and perhaps even inconsistencies within the policy. But I think the main takeaway here is that there are exceptions.
Okay.
And that brings us to the world of waivers.
Okay, so it's not all doom and gloom if you can't find 100% American-made materials. The policy recognizes that there are situations where it just doesn't make sense or might even be impossible to stick to those strict Buy America requirements. So tell us about these waivers. What are the main types that our listeners should be aware of?
Well, there are 4 primary types: public interest, non-availability, unreasonable cost, and general applicability. Each one addresses a different scenario where strict adherence to Buy America might be problematic.
Okay, so break those down for us. Public interest sounds pretty straightforward. It's when using all American-made materials would somehow harm the public good.
Exactly. It's about weighing the benefits of Buy America against the potential negative consequences.
Okay.
Non-availability waivers are for when you just can't get the materials you need domestically.
Right.
Either they're not produced in the U.S. at all, or maybe there's not enough to meet the demand, or the quality isn't up to par.
So it's not just about finding something that is technically American-made.
Right.
It has to be a viable option both in terms of quality and availability.
Exactly. And then you have the unreasonable cost waiver. This one comes into play when using only American-made materials would increase the cost of the project by more than 25%.
Okay.
So it's a way to protect projects from becoming exorbitantly expensive because of Buy America restrictions.
That 25% threshold is a pretty interesting detail. It suggests that there's some wiggle room built into the policy,
Yeah.
recognizing that promoting American products shouldn't come at the expense of making projects completely unaffordable.
Exactly. It's about finding a balance. And finally, we have the general applicability waivers. These are kind of like blanket exemptions that apply to specific situations across the board.
These are the ones that I found really interesting, like the fact that small projects under $250,000 are automatically exempt.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yes.
The paperwork alone for Buy America compliance could eat up a huge chunk of a small project's budget.
Yeah. It's about recognizing that the burden of compliance might outweigh the benefits for smaller scale projects. And then there's the de minimis waiver, which allows you to use a small percentage of foreign materials,
Okay.
up to 5% of the total cost, but not exceeding $1 million.
So it's like saying, okay, we know you can't always find absolutely everything you need from American suppliers, so we'll give you a little wiggle room. But isn't there a risk that companies might try to exploit that? I mean, how strictly is that 5% rule enforced?
That's a valid point. There's always the potential for loopholes to be exploited, and that's something that policymakers and oversight agencies really need to be mindful of.
Right.
And then there's a specific waiver for manufacturers who use minor components that are foreign made,
Okay.
but the majority of their product is still U.S. made.
So it's like saying, hey, we get that global supply chains are a reality, so we're not going to penalize you for using a small part that happens to be made overseas,
Yeah,
as long as the bulk of your product is still American.
exactly. It's about recognizing the complexities of modern manufacturing and finding ways to support domestic production without being overly restrictive.
So it sounds like these waivers provide a lot of flexibility within the framework of Buy America.
Yeah.
But I imagine the process of actually getting a waiver approved can be pretty daunting. There's probably a ton of paperwork involved, right?
You're not wrong. It can be a bit of a bureaucratic maze.
All right, so let's dive into that maze and unravel this whole waiver process. What are the key things that our listener needs to know?
Well, first and foremost, it's a multi-step process. It involves the recipient of the FEMA funds, FEMA itself, and even the Office of Management and Budgets Made in America office.
Oh, wow.
So there are multiple layers of review and approval.
Sounds like a lot of cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah.
What are some of the potential pitfalls or roadblocks that our listeners should be aware of? What are the things that could trip people up or cause delays?
One crucial aspect is transparency. All proposed waivers are posted for public comment, so there's this element of public scrutiny involved, which is important for accountability,
Of course.
but it can also add time and complexity to the process.
That makes sense. If you're going to make an exception to the Buy America rule, you want to make sure it's for a legitimate reason and that the public has a chance to weigh in.
Right. And speaking of time, that's another critical factor. Most waiver requests take around 60 days to be processed.
Okay.
But renewals of those general applicability waivers we talked about earlier
Right.
can take up to 75 days.
So if you're working on a project with a tight timeline, you really need to factor in those potential delays. And it sounds like navigating this whole waiver process could be a real headache for someone who's not familiar with the ins and outs of government bureaucracy.
It definitely can be.
Yeah.
But the good news is that FEMA has a ton of resources available on their website,
Okay.
including detailed information on the waiver process and even a database of previously approved waivers.
So if our listener is feeling a bit overwhelmed, don't panic. There's help out there.
Yeah.
And honestly, just knowing that those approved waivers are publicly available is a huge help. You can see what types of requests have been granted in the past and get a better sense of what might fly and what might not.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to navigating government regulations.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, from the basics of BABAA and the surprising breadth of programs covered to the intricacies of material definitions and this whole waiver process. It's clear that this Buy America preference policy is more complicated than meets the eye.
It's not just a simple Buy American slogan. There are a lot of moving parts and nuances to consider.
And I think we've just scratched the surface. In part 2, we're going to delve even deeper into the implications of this policy and explore some real-world examples of how this plays out. So stick with us, because this deep dive is about to get even more interesting.
I'm excited.
Welcome back to the deep dive. So far, we've unpacked the nuts and bolts of FEMA's Buy America preference policy.
Yep.
Now let's shift gears a little bit and explore why this policy actually matters, especially for you.
This policy isn't just some, abstract government regulation. It has very real consequences, especially if you're involved in infrastructure projects or community development.
Right. It's easy to get lost in all the acronyms and the legal jargon. But at the end of the day, this policy really impacts how things get built in this country.
Yeah.
From bridges to fire stations to water treatment plants.
And while the intention of promoting American jobs and industry is certainly laudable,
Right.
it also introduces this layer of complexity and sometimes even tension into the process.
So let's talk about those complexities.
Yeah.
I'm imagining a scenario where a small town wants to rebuild its community center after a hurricane,
Okay.
and they're applying for FEMA funding.
Right.
Seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, you would think so, but not necessarily. Now they have to make sure that all the steel, the concrete, the windows, even the doorknobs are sourced from American companies. And that's not always as easy as it sounds.
So instead of just focusing on getting the best materials for the job at the best price,
Right.
they now have to navigate this whole other layer of sourcing requirements
Yeah.
that sounds like it could add a lot of time and potentially even drive up costs.
Absolutely. And what if they can't find a certain type of material that meets their specific needs and is also made in the USA?
Right.
They're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
That's where those waivers that we talked about earlier come in, right?
Exactly.
But even applying for a waiver is a process in itself.
Right.
It's like adding another layer of bureaucracy to an already complex system.
Exactly. It involves paperwork justifications, potentially even public scrutiny.
Yeah.
And there's no guarantee that the waiver will even be granted.
Oh, wow.
So you have this delicate balance between, supporting American industries and ensuring that vital projects can actually move forward
Right.
without being bogged down by red tape or becoming exorbitantly expensive.
I'm starting to see why understanding this policy is so crucial. It's not just about blindly following the rules.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the nuances, the potential pitfalls,
Yeah,
the strategic decisions that need to be made along the way.
precisely. Whether you're directly involved in infrastructure projects or just a concerned citizen who cares about how your tax dollars are being spent, having a grasp of this policy gives you valuable insight into how things work.
Okay, so let's get even more practical.
Okay.
What are some real-world examples of how this policy plays out on the ground?
Okay, let's say a coastal town wants to upgrade its seawall to protect against rising sea levels,
Okay.
and they're relying on FEMA grants for funding.
Right.
They find out that the specialized pumps they need for the project are only manufactured in Europe.
Okay, so what do?
That's a tough one, right?
Yeah, do they try to find a comparable American-made pump, even if it's not as efficient
Right.
or costs twice as much?
Right.
Or do they go through that whole waiver process, which could delay the project for months?
Those are the real-world dilemmas that this policy creates, and the decision-making process can be incredibly challenging.
Yeah.
In this case, they might be able to argue for a non-availability waiver,
Okay.
but they need to prove that they made a good faith effort to find a suitable domestic alternative
Okay.
and provide very strong justification for why they need to go overseas for this specific component.
It makes you wonder how often those kinds of situations arise.
I'm sure it happens quite a bit.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about that 25% cost increase threshold for the unreasonable cost waiver.
Right.
I imagine that could be a pretty tricky calculation to make.
Absolutely. There's a lot of subjectivity involved.
Right.
What's considered unreasonable in one context
Yeah.
might be perfectly acceptable in another.
Right.
It depends on the project, the budget,
Yeah.
the available alternatives. It's not a simple black and white formula.
So it's not just about crunching numbers. There's a lot of judgment involved as well.
Exactly. And that's why having a deep understanding of the policy and the potential implications of different decisions is so important.
Okay, let's look at another example. This time, a small town needs to repair a bridge that was damaged in a flood.
Okay.
The estimated cost of the project is $200,000.
In that case, they would likely fall under that small projects exemption that we talked about earlier.
Right.
Since the project cost is under $250,000,
Okay.
they wouldn't even have to worry about Buy America restrictions.
So the policy does recognize that sometimes the administrative burden of compliance
Right.
outweighs the benefits.
Especially for those smaller scale projects.
Right. What about those de minimis waivers?
Okay.
The ones that let you sneak in a small percentage of foreign materials.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know how those play out in practice.
Let's say a city is building a new emergency operations center.
Okay.
They've sourced most of the materials domestically,
Right.
but they need a specific type of computer server for their communications system.
Yeah.
And the only company that makes it is based in Japan.
So they're mostly in compliance.
Right.
But there's this one crucial component that they need from overseas.
Exactly.
So what happens then?
If the cost of that server is less than 5% of the total cost of materials for the project, or less than $1 million,
Right.
they could use that de minimis waiver
Okay.
to kind of get around those Buy America restrictions.
So it's like a safety valve built into the system,
Yeah,
recognizing that there are these situations where strict adherence to the policy just isn't feasible.
exactly. It's about pragmatism and finding ways to ensure that vital projects can move forward without being unnecessarily hampered by rigid regulations.
Okay, so we've looked at some real-world examples, and it's clear that this Buy America preference policy has a significant impact on how infrastructure projects are planned and executed.
Yeah.
But I'm also curious about the broader implications, the ripple effects that go beyond just these individual projects.
Right.
What are some of the long-term impacts we might see as a result of this policy?
That's where things get even more interesting. One key area to consider is innovation.
How? So I wouldn't think a procurement policy would have much to do with innovation.
Well, by prioritizing domestic products, the policy could potentially create an environment where there's less incentive to seek out or adopt cutting-edge technologies that are developed overseas.
So if a foreign company comes up with a revolutionary new type of concrete that's stronger, cheaper, and more sustainable, but an American company makes a perfectly adequate, albeit less innovative version,
Yeah.
the American product is going to get preferential treatment.
In many cases, yes. And that could have long-term consequences for the advancement of certain sectors. It's this trade-off between protecting existing American industries and potentially stifling progress.
That's a fascinating point. I hadn't really considered that angle before.
And then there's the issue of cost.
Okay.
While the intention is to boost the American economy,
Right.
the policy could inadvertently lead to higher costs for infrastructure projects.
Right, because domestic materials might be more expensive
Exactly.
than their foreign counterparts.
And ultimately, those higher costs are likely passed on to taxpayers.
Right, so it's not just about these theoretical economic impacts.
Yeah.
There are real-world financial consequences that need to be weighed.
Absolutely. And it's important to have those open and honest conversations about these potential downsides.
Right.
Alongside the intended benefits. There's no such thing as a perfect policy, and understanding those trade-offs is crucial for making informed decisions.
This is giving me a whole new perspective on this policy.
That
It's
does.
so much more than just a simple Buy American slogan.
Right.
There are so many layers and complexities to consider.
There are a lot of moving parts.
And there are also geopolitical considerations, right?
Oh, absolutely. By favoring American products, the policy could potentially create some friction with trading partners
Yeah.
who might see it as protectionist or unfair.
So there are international relations implications as well.
There are.
It's like this policy sits at the intersection of economics, politics,
Yeah.
and even national security.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating to unpack. It touches on so many different aspects of our society.
Okay, so we've explored the practical implications of this policy. We've delved into some real-world examples.
We have.
And we've even considered those broader economic and geopolitical ripple effects.
Right.
I think it's safe to say at this point that our listener now has a much deeper understanding of the Buy America preference policy
I would agree.
and its impact on infrastructure projects. But we still have one more part to go.
We do.
In part 3, we're going to shift our focus to the future.
Okay.
What are some of the potential developments and trends that could shape the evolution of this policy? Stay tuned for some thought-provoking insights. We spent the last 2 parts really dissecting FEMA's Buy America preference policy. We went from the basics to some pretty nuanced examples and even touched on some of the bigger picture impacts. But like with anything in the world of policy, things are constantly evolving, right?
Oh, absolutely. You know what's so intriguing about this particular policy is that it's not static.
Right.
It exists within this dynamic landscape of, economic forces,
Yeah.
political pressures, and even global events.
Yeah.
So looking ahead, there are several potential developments that could really reshape how Buy America functions in the future.
Okay, so let's put on our prognostication hats here.
All right.
What are some of the trends or changes that our listeners should be paying attention to?
Well, one possibility is that we'll see some adjustments to the specific requirements of the policy.
Okay.
Think of it like fine-tuning the engine.
Okay.
Right now, the threshold for domestic content in manufactured goods is set at 55%,
Right.
but that number isn't set in stone.
So you're saying that down the road that 55% could be bumped up to, say, 60% or even 70%,
Exactly.
making it even stricter for companies to meet those Buy America criteria.
It could go the other way, too. They might lower it to 50% if they feel like it's hindering too many projects or becoming a burden on certain industries. We could also see changes to the list of covered materials,
Oh, wow.
expanding it to include new categories or perhaps narrowing it down to focus on specific areas that are deemed really critical for national security or economic competitiveness.
So even though the basic premise of Buy America is likely to remain the devil is in the details,
Right.
those specific requirements can have a huge impact on how the policy actually plays out in practice.
That's a great analogy.
It's like adjusting the knobs and dials
Yeah.
to fine-tune the outcome.
And another area where we might see some changes is in the waiver process.
Okay.
We talked about how those waivers provide some flexibility, but there's always room for improvement.
When we were discussing the waiver process, I was really struck by how complex it is
Yeah.
and how much discretion is involved.
Right.
Are you saying there could be a push to streamline the process or make it more transparent?
Absolutely. There could be increased public pressure for greater accountability and oversight
Sure.
in how those waivers are granted. We might see stricter criteria being applied or more rigorous review processes to ensure that waivers are only granted when truly justified.
That makes a lot of sense after all. Any exception to the Buy America rule has the potential to undermine the policy's original intent.
Right.
So it's natural that there would be some scrutiny there.
Yeah.
It's like this constant tug of war between upholding the principle of Buy America
Yeah,
and recognizing the need for flexibility in certain situations.
exactly. And we can't discount the possibility of legal challenges to the policy either.
Oh, interesting. From whom would it be foreign companies arguing that the policy is discriminatory or violates trade agreements?
It could be.
Or could it even be American companies who feel like it puts them at a disadvantage in certain situations?
It could be either or even both. We might see companies or industry groups arguing that the policy is unfair, that it's protectionist, or that it violates international trade agreements.
Right.
Those legal battles could end up shaping the future interpretation and application of the Buy America Act.
So the courts could essentially become the referees, deciding where that line is drawn between supporting American businesses and ensuring a level playing field for everyone.
Exactly.
It sounds like we could be in for some pretty interesting legal showdowns in the years to come.
It'll be interesting to see how it all unfolds.
This whole discussion is making me realize just how much is riding on this policy. It's not just about procurement. It really touches on so many broader issues like economic policy, international relations, and even national security.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating case study, I think, in how these seemingly niche policies can actually have these really broad implications.
Okay, so we've covered potential adjustments to the policy's requirements, increased scrutiny of the waiver process, and even the possibility of these legal challenges.
Right.
But what about the bigger picture?
Yeah.
How might this Buy America policy influence broader trends in government procurement?
That's a great question. FEMA might actually be a bellwether for other federal agencies.
Okay.
If Buy America is deemed to be successful, however they ultimately define success. Yeah.
We might see similar provisions being adopted by other departments, especially those dealing with infrastructure, transportation, or defense.
So it's like a policy experiment playing out in real time, and the results could have far-reaching consequences for how the government spends money and supports American industries.
Absolutely. And it's not just about government spending. This focus on domestic production could spark broader conversations about economic nationalism versus free trade, about the role of government in shaping markets, and about finding that balance between supporting American workers and ensuring that we're still competitive on a global scale.
Wow, we've really come full circle, haven't we?
We have.
We started by diving into the nitty-gritty details of this policy, and now we're talking about its potential to influence national and even global trends.
That's the beauty of a deep dive. You start with one specific topic,
Right.
and it often leads you to unexpected places and opens up these whole new avenues of inquiry. Well said. So to bring this back to our listener, What's the key takeaway from all of this? Why should they care about the future of FEMA's Buy America preference policy?
Whether you're working on infrastructure projects, bidding on government contracts, or just a citizen who cares about how public funds are being used, this policy is something to keep an eye on. It's a microcosm, I think, of these larger debates that are happening right now about how we balance, economic interest, national security, and global competitiveness.
Yeah.
And the choices that we make today are really going to have a lasting impact on how we build and invest in our future.
Absolutely. And as always, we encourage you to continue exploring, researching, and engaging with these topics. We've just scratched the surface here. There's a whole world of information out there, and we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity to learn more.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure diving into this with you.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.